There is a fundamental flaw with the term white balance that's causing a lot of photographers and filmmakers to misunderstand it and get inaccurate colours with their images. So today I'll be sharing with you 3 reasons why I shoot manual white balance to get higher quality skin tones, better looking colours, and overall a more consistent gallery for my clients. And I'm going to start right now. Okay, so before we start talking about why I recommend shooting in manual white balance, let's talk a little bit about the term white balance and what does it mean for photographers. So white balance is how your camera captures colour, and your white balance of your camera is designed to offset the colour of light within your scene. Now, every light source has a certain temperature value attributed to it. So to get accurate colours within your images, you want to correctly set the white balance of your camera to get true to life colours. Now, the most common neutral setting that you'll find, especially if you're shooting outside, is 5600 Kelvin. But depending on the time of day, like for example, maybe you're shooting at sunrise or sunset, as well as the weather may change that value. It's the same situation when you're shooting in a studio, for example. Every single light will have a different temperature value. So you want to set your camera to offset that color value of that light. Now, if you're new to photography or video, or you've just never really experimented with white balance before, the likelihood you've probably just been shooting in auto white balance. And in most situations, you're probably going to be okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with shooting in auto white balance. But the problem is, your camera is not always right. So here are 3 reasons why I recommend shooting in manual white balance as a photographer, but also filmmaker. Now, the main problem I find when shooting in auto white balance is your camera is trying to replicate accurate colours. And this can be a problem, especially if you're shooting in a very warm or very cool lighting conditions. Your camera is trying to be very logical and precise, and at the end of the day, it's just a piece of technology with no personality or thought behind its actions. Your camera doesn't know that you're shooting at sunset, for example, so it's looking at the scene and noticing there's a lot of warm tones within your image. So to combat those warm tones, the camera will introduce more blue by lowering its temperature value to try and remove those warm tones from the image. And for a camera, that's the logical thing to do. But you know, as a photographer, that that's not going to look aesthetically pleasing. At the end of the day, you're shooting in golden hour for a reason. So to prevent having those correct colours, I recommend shooting in manual white balance. Firstly, this will give you more creative control over the colours you're either adding or removing from your image, as well as it will prevent these odd colour casts appearing in your photo. And it's obvious when you view an image side by side. Which image looks better? Is it the one on the left with the correct logical white balance, or is it the one on the right where we've shot in manual white balance to get the right white balance for the scene? So the next time you're shooting in a challenging lighting environment, maybe for example shooting at sunrise or sunset, I recommend placing the camera in manual white balance mode. Maybe try 6500 Kelvin and seeing if you prefer those colours over shooting in auto white balance. Hopefully you'll prefer the more creative control that white balance can offer. Now, the second reason I like shooting in manual white balance is white balance can actually change the exposure, and it's all to do with the luminosity of colours. Now, if we have a look at the colour wheel, we can see that they all look roughly the same brightness, but it's a lot more obvious when we go ahead and remove the saturation of those colours, just leaving the luminosity. You can see that the yellows are far brighter than the blues. In fact, most warmer colours are brighter than cooler colours. Now we can see this in graphic design in 2 examples. Firstly, we can have a look at any warning signs. You can see that they're using yellows and reds because it's a higher contrast colour versus black. We can also see it in text. Have a look at the text on the left and on the right, which is easier to read. One is yellow and one is blue. You can see that the yellow is easier to read versus black than the blue, and it's all to do with the brightness of that colour. So you can see that colour can actually change the overall luminosity and brightness of your image. So when shooting an auto white balance, you haven't got control over the colours you're adding in. It could be very blue or very yellow. So one scene to another might be a different brightness, and you might have to try and fix that in post, which just adds another step of complexity, which you don't necessarily want to do, especially as a photographer. So one of the main reasons I like shooting in manual white balance is you've got control over the brightness. It's another reason is I recommend changing white balance first in your edit before you change your exposure, for exactly the same reason. Because if you change your exposure first, then go to white balance, you might have to find you have to go back into your exposure to fix it again, slowing you down in your edit. So when you're editing, firstly change your white balance, then change your exposure, because not all colours are the same brightness. So my third and last reason why I recommend shooting in manual white balance is not all cameras' auto white balance are the same. Now this is noticeable if you've got two of the same camera, like myself, I've got two Canon EOS R5s, or if you're shooting on two completely separate brands. Maybe you've got a Canon or a Sony or a Sigma and a Nikon, for example. Every single camera is going to have a different interpretation when it comes to its auto white balance. Now, you might not necessarily notice this if you've only got one camera because you've got nothing to compare it to. You've got no variables to look at and go and notice the difference. But it's very noticeable when you're pointing two cameras at basically the identical scene. Now, again, if you're a wedding photographer, you really want to have consistent colours throughout your entire gallery. So shooting an auto white balance on two different types of cameras, you might notice a colour shift between camera A and camera B. Now, this could be for multiple reasons. What you're pointing at, for example, maybe you've got camera A is at a 45-degree angle and camera B is pointing directly down the aisle. Well, you're having a slight angle change. Maybe you've got slightly different lenses. Maybe the light in one shot is different to a light in another shot. Maybe you've got one light on the edge and another light on the edge, and each camera is only capturing one light. Well, in that case, then having manual white balance is incredibly important to keep consistency, because consistency in color is very noticeable when you're applying it to a gallery. If you're only taking one photo, then to be honest with you, auto white balance is probably going to be okay. But if you're shooting more than one photo or more than one camera, consistency is key. So to keep consistency in both exposure and color, manual white balance is incredibly important. And it doesn't matter what camera you've got. You could have a Nikon and a Sony. If you're shooting in manual white balance, that's going to limit the amount of variables that you're going to have to change in post, because the last thing you want to do is spend hours upon hours correcting colors when you could have easily got it right in camera. So, do I recommend shooting in manual white balance for every photographer? Of course not. Shooting in auto white balance can be really helpful, especially if in a really fast-paced environment and you don't have time to get colors correct in camera. But me personally, I try and use manual white balance as much as possible. I'm using white balance now because I know the lighting situation I'm in and I want to make sure that every scene is the same and I don't have to change it in post to get them looking consistent, as well as for all my weddings. Because I'm shooting on two cameras and a variety of different lenses, I want to make sure that my colours are as consistent as possible, and one way to do that is to shoot in manual white balance. Now, to get better colours, I recommend using something like this. This is a grey card. So shooting in manual white balance is important, but you need to know what white balance to shoot in, and that is where something like this becomes really helpful. You've got a giant grey card on this side, and then you've got a whole range of colours on this side. So you're not just looking at overall colour cast, you're also looking at simply the colours as well, because like I was saying, the correct white balance doesn't necessarily mean it's the right white balance. For example, if you're shooting in sunrise or sunset, the sun isn't going to be producing white. So even if you're taking a photo of a wedding dress, for example, that wedding dress isn't going to look white visually. So why try and replicate that in camera? You need to make sure that your colours look correct for the lighting conditions you're shooting in, and that really sums up what white balance, the fundamental problem with white balance, and it's the name, white balance. You're not aiming for white, you're aiming for the correct colours or the right colours for your scene. You don't want to get pure white because it really depends on the lighting conditions you're shooting in. Now, if you'd like to learn more about this and how to use this in both photography and editing, make sure you go ahead and watch this video here where I basically discuss how to use something like this. It's incredibly helpful and I highly recommend it to every single photographer and also filmmaker. Now, if you'd like to learn more about colour and photography, make sure to go ahead and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I make new videos on this channel every single week. I've been James for Photo Fever, and I'll catch you guys next time.